Okay, this video is going to be all about the CSS box model. So in web development, in the front end, basically everything is a box. So it might not look like a box, but actually if you look here, you inspect this, go to inspect, and you'll see everything's a box. There's boxes everywhere. There's the blue box, that yellowish orange boxes here, and if you click on it, you can go here, you see the body. So this is the whole body that I'm selecting right now. You see that's a box. The HTML is a box. Basically everything is a box. So if you had elements inside of elements inside of elements, everything is just a box. Even if it looks round, the actual container that is that's seen by the browser basically it's still interpreting it as a box. So you could add a border radius to something to make it look round, but it will still occupy the space as if it was a box. Okay, let me just go and make some default styles. I think I'm just going to throw up a slide right now while I do this. Hopefully there's enough time for you to actually read the slide. And alright, so I got these basic styles here on this H1. Just setting the margin to 0, setting the font family, setting the background color to be crimson, and setting the color to be white. Alright, let's look at this now. As a matter of fact, I only want one of these. So, okay, let's select this. So, because I'm inspecting the page, down here, right here, you could see, if this was smaller, that I think would be hidden. It might be at the bottom. So it might be in a bit of a different place for you, this box right here with the margin, border, padding, and content. But if you open this up a little bit bigger on Google Chrome, you'll be able to see this box right here, which is super helpful, and it basically explains what I'm going to be explaining in this video, the margin, padding, and border. So the first thing, when you have an element, the text inside the element will take up its content box. So the content box is the actual content that's inside your element. That could either be text or it could be other elements. So that would be the content. So right now our HTML, or our H1 here, it only has content. There's no margin, there's no padding, and there's no border, and there's no padding. And here you could see it's telling you how big the content box is. It's telling you it's 37 pixels in height and 1261 pixels width, and that will change when the screen gets smaller. So you see it just changed. Okay, so let's go to our styles now and let's add some padding to it. So padding is like used to make an element more fat. It just makes the element bigger. But okay, so padding could be set on the top, the bottom, the left, and the right of an element. So a shorthand for setting the padding on all sides of the box at the same time is just by setting padding to one value. So padding 26 pixels will set padding on all sides of the box. So like this. So if you look down here at the padding, you can see there's 26, 26, 26, and 26. But there's other ways to set padding too. There is 10 pixels, 40 pixels. So what this is saying 10 pixels on the top and bottom, and 40 pixels on the left and right. Should we semicolon? So you see 10 on the top and bottom, and 40 on the left and right. And there's even other ways to set padding. There is a 3 value. So what this is 32 on the top, 40 on the left and right, and 12 on the bottom. So you see 32 on top, 40 on the left and right, and 12 on the bottom. And the other way is just 4 values. So when you're setting 4 values, it's like you're setting at the top first, so 12 pixels, and then it's like you're going clockwise. So it's from the top, then the the right, then the bottom, then the left. So let's see. So I'm setting a lot of padding on one side, which this is actually the right, but you can't really see it. So let's just do 10 pixels on the right, and this is the left. So let's do 120 on the bottom. So you see here in the padding box, it's different all around. 12 on the bottom, 18 on the left, 10 on the right, and 120 on the bottom. And that's all done with one line right here. And then there's also specifying the sides. So you set padding left separately. You set padding left to 10, and there's all the sides. There's right, there's top. It's not auto-completing right now because I didn't put a actual value here. There's top and bottom. So these are all the different ways to set padding. I'm going to delete this for now. Just keep the first one. Okay, and then we're going to move on to border. Okay, so the border, it just adds a border to your element like you would expect, except it's important to know that it comes after the padding. So if you set a padding to make your element fat, the border will come after that. Okay, let's put a color of blue and a display, put a display of inline block. So this is just going to make the element not take up the whole width. And I set the background color to be transparent. And let's set the border to 6 pixel dashed crimson. Alright, let's see what we just did. Okay, so see how there's all this extra space between the text and the border. That's the padding. If you look right here, you can see all that green highlighted. That's the padding. Then the border comes after it. So it's really important to remember that. There's other ways to set border too. You can set border 6 pixel dashed. So if you leave out the color in your border, it will inherit the color of its color property. So the color property is blue, so this will make a blue border. Then there's also dotted. And then the most used is probably just solid. Solid borders. And there's also border radius, which doesn't really have to do with the border, but it sort of does, you know, it's border. But this just makes the corners less sharp. So if you look here, so you could do that. You could also, let's set a lot of padding on the left and right. I'll set even more actually. And then you can set the border radius to be very high, and that will get you a pill-shaped element. Usually for buttons, when you want, like Twitter does that, where they have these buttons shaped like this. So you can do that, but just by having a really high border radius. And okay, so let's delete all this. And like padding, you can set border to the bottom, or just the left, or just the right. So this is setting the border all around it, and then you could say border bottom 2 pixel solid, and also left. So this, you get this sort of looking effect right here. All right, and lastly is the margin. Margin works kind of similar to padding. It could be applied in the same way as padding. So in all of our padding shorthand, the ways of using the padding property before with 1 value, 2 values, 3 values, or 4 values, or setting it on the top and bottom or the left and right. Padding, margin works the exact same, so that's already covered. There's a few things that margin does that padding doesn't do. The first thing is it's applied after the border. So whereas padding makes an element fatter, it actually makes the element bigger. Margin doesn't make the element bigger, it just gives the element more personal space. So it stops other elements from getting too close to that element. Okay, so the first thing I want to do here is I want to get rid of the display, and I want to add more H1s. So you see by default they're just like stacked on top of each other. There's no space between them. You could change that with margin. So again, it works in the exact same way as padding. So this is just doing 22 pixels on the top and bottom and 0 on the left and right, and you'll see that these elements have more space now. Okay, and the last thing I need to talk about margin is margin auto. So we've seen that a few times already in this section where I've positioned the things by setting margin to be like 0 auto or some value auto. So I'm going to explain what that is. So we've seen already that H1 or block elements in general take up the full width of its container. So let's set, not the display, let's set the width of this H1 to be whatever, it could be 400 pixels. The idea is that I'm going to give it enough width so that they could stay on the same line. But they don't, because they're block elements. So block elements automatically start on a new line, even if the width is big enough for them not to. Because this second one right here, there's enough space for it to fit right here, but it's not doing that. And let's inspect, let's see why. Okay, if you look right here, you could see there's margin on top and bottom. That's that yellow orangish color. I think it's more like an orange, but whatever. And you can see there's a lot on the right. It actually takes up the full container on the right. The remaining space is margin. So it's just, so basically when you set a block element to have a smaller width, it adds margin on the right to make sure that that element takes up that full width that it needs to. And this is actually so important for browsers that if you try to set the margin right to be 0, and also we haven't seen this yet, I don't think, but when you set important, that like makes this specific declaration right here super important, that it will be applied even if another more specific rule tells it to do something else. So this will override any sort of specific rules. It just makes this super important that no matter what, set the margin right to be 0. And let's see what happens. When we inspect the page, we can see that there is still some margin on the right. It doesn't say so here, but you could see that it's setting margin on the right. And it sort of has to do that because browsers aren't magic, you know, there has to be a way that they work to make a block element act like a block element. And it does that by forcing margin on the right of an element. So that brings me to margin auto. How it does that is by default, it sets the margin right to be auto. What auto means is it means calculate how much margin you would have to add to this element to make sure that it takes up the full width of its container. And you can only do this on block elements because block elements need to take up the full width of their container. So if they're too small, like right here, when we're setting the width to 400 pixels, it needs extra margin to make sure that the element takes up the container. So one thing that we could do actually, if we just set margin left to auto, now the browser is not going to set any margin on the right because since we're specifying margin auto on the left, it's just going to add all that automatic margin, the margin that it needs to take up the full width of its container. It's going to put that all on the left. And basically what that's going to do is it's going to take all these elements and push them over here like that. So now when you inspect it, you see the margin is on the left And finally, that brings me to my final point, is setting margin 22 pixels, auto. So we know that the first value is the top and bottom, and the second value is the left and right. So when you're setting the left and right to be auto, you're saying basically share all that extra margin that needs to be added. So that basically just centers them. Whoops, did I not save it? Ah, it's the important. See that? I think that's messing it up. Maybe not. Okay, it was. So now you can see that these are all centered because there's the same amount of margin on the left and the right. So they're just splitting it. Instead of putting all that extra margin just on one side, you can put it on both sides equally. So that's going to be it for this video.